The story of how the British Empire gained control over India and dismantled the Mughal Empire is a tale of gradual influence, calculated diplomacy, and a series of well-timed battles. In the early 17th century, when the British first arrived in India, they were simply traders. The East India Company, a British trading entity, landed in India with the primary goal of securing trading privileges. They came with no grand plans for conquest but sought only to expand their commercial interests. Yet, through a series of calculated moves, aided by the decline of the Mughal Empire, the British would eventually establish a firm hold on the Indian subcontinent. By the early 18th century, the once mighty Mughal Empire was already beginning to fracture. The empire, which had reached its zenith under rulers like Akbar, Jahangir, and Shah Jahan, had by this time seen a decline in centralized power. Aurangzeb, the last of the strong Mughal emperors, had expanded the empire to its greatest extent, but his policies, particularly his religious intolerance, had sown seeds of resentment. After his death in 1707, the Mughal Empire struggled to maintain control over its vast territories. Weak leadership and constant internal conflict over succession rights further destabilized the empire, allowing regional rulers to grow in power and influence. Provinces once controlled by the emperor became semi-independent, led by Nawabs, Nizams, and Rajas who owed only nominal allegiance to the Mughal throne. This decentralization created an environment where foreign entities like the British East India Company could exploit the political vacuum. The East India Company, with permission from local rulers, began establishing trading posts in coastal cities such as Surat, Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta. These posts initially served only as commercial hubs for trading in Indian goods like spices, textiles, and tea, which were in high demand in Europe. As the company's wealth grew, so did its political influence. The company maintained a private army to protect its trade interests, which soon grew into a formidable military force. It also developed diplomatic relations with local rulers, gradually manipulating local politics to its advantage. The British were adept at understanding the internal dynamics of the region, and they capitalized on local rivalries to expand their influence. By forming strategic alliances and supporting certain factions within the Indian states, they positioned themselves as powerful intermediaries. The company's first significant military victory came in 1757 at the Battle of Plassey, a turning point that would drastically alter India's fate. The battle was fought between Siraj-ud-Dowlah, the Nawab of Bengal, and forces led by Robert Clive of the East India Company. The British, although outnumbered, were able to secure a decisive victory through strategic planning and the betrayal of Mir Jafar, one of the Nawab's commanders, who was promised the throne in exchange for his support. This battle not only gave the British control over Bengal, one of the wealthiest regions in India, but also established their military superiority. With Bengal under their control, the East India Company now had direct access to immense resources and revenue, which they used to fund further expansion. With Bengal secured, the company implemented what is known as the dual government system in 1765, after the Battle of Buxar, where the East India Company defeated the combined forces of the Mughal Emperor, the Nawab of Bengal, and the Nawab of Awadh. Following this victory, the Mughal Emperor granted the company Diwani rights, which allowed him to collect revenue in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. However, the company did not assume full administrative control, allowing local rulers to maintain nominal authority. This arrangement allowed the British to extract wealth while avoiding direct governance, which insulated them from local grievances. However, the financial exploitation led to widespread economic distress in the region, especially among the local peasantry, who were subjected to high taxes and often forced into debt. The British continued to expand their influence by engaging in a series of wars with regional powers that posed a threat to their dominance. They clashed with the Marathas, a confederacy that had become a formidable force in India after the decline of the Mughals. Over a series of conflicts known as the Anglo-Maratha Wars, the British gradually subdued the Marathas, solidifying their control over large parts of central India. Another significant adversary was Tipu Sultan of Mysore, who resisted British encroachment fiercely. Tipu aligned with the French in his efforts to counter British influence, but after 4 Anglo-Mysore wars, he was defeated and killed in 1799. The defeat of these regional powers removed significant obstacles, enabling the British to consolidate their rule over more territories. As the British expanded their control, they began restructuring India's economy to serve their interests. Traditional industries, particularly the textile industry, were undermined by British policies. Raw materials like cotton were exported to Britain, where they were manufactured into finished goods that were then sold back to Indian markets. This approach devastated local industries and artisans, who found it increasingly difficult to compete with cheaper British goods. The British also implemented land revenue systems such as the zamindari system and the rivalry system. These systems increased the financial burden on Indian farmers, many of whom fell into severe debt as they struggled to meet the high tax demands. This economic exploitation led to widespread poverty, famine, and social unrest, particularly in rural areas. In 1857, these mounting grievances culminated in a large-scale uprising against British rule. Known as the Indian Rebellion of 1857, or the First War of Independence, this revolt was led by a coalition of soldiers, local leaders, and civilians who were frustrated by British exploitation and interference in the cultural and religious practices. The rebellion began as a mutiny among Indian soldiers, or sepoys, in the British East India Company's army. Several factors triggered the uprising, including the introduction of rifle cartridges greased with animal fat, which was offensive to both Hindu and Muslim soldiers. However, the revolt quickly grew beyond the issue of cartridges, encompassing broader discontent with British rule. The rebellion spread across northern India, and for a time, it appeared that the British might lose their hold on the subcontinent. The rebels declared Bahadur Shah Zafar, the last Mughal emperor, as their symbolic leader. Although he was by then an elderly and powerless figurehead, his presence lent legitimacy to the rebellion. However, the British were able to suppress the uprising through a combination of military force, divide and rule tactics, and brutal reprisals. They retook control of Delhi and exiled Bahadur Shah Zafar to Burma, effectively ending the Mughal Empire. In the aftermath of the rebellion, the British government decided to dissolve the East India Company and assume direct control of India. In 1858, the British Crown officially took over, and India became a British colony. This marked the beginning of what is known as the British Raj. Queen Victoria was later declared the Empress of India in 1876, symbolizing the British monarchy's authority over the subcontinent. Under the Raj, the British continued to exploit India's resources for their own benefit, but they also implemented administrative reforms and introduced Western education, infrastructure, and legal systems. The takeover of India by the British was not merely a military conquest, it was a complex process of economic manipulation, political maneuvering, and strategic alliances. By the time the British established full control, India had been transformed into a major economic asset for the empire, supplying raw materials and serving as a captive market for British goods. However, this transformation came at a tremendous cost to the Indian people. The economic policies imposed by the British drained India's wealth and stunted its industrial development, creating deep-seated social and economic issues that would persist long after independence was achieved in 1947. The fall of the Mughal Empire and the rise of British rule in India remains a profound example of how colonial powers capitalized on internal divisions and economic incentives to establish dominance. The legacy of British rule is still visible in India's infrastructure, legal system, and political institutions, but so are the scars of exploitation and cultural disruption. The British takeover reshaped India's history, setting the stage for its future struggles for independence and the complex identity that the nation would go on to forge in the years that followed.